England, winter, 1944. The airfield at Boxted was a wasteland of mud and frost. The war in Europe was nearing its bloody end, but the fight in the sky was still vicious, cold, metallic, and merciless. In the corner of the hangar, among dead engines and empty oil drums, Sergeant Ray Haskell was breaking every rule in the manual. The rest of the mechanics watched in disbelief. Some smirked, some shook their heads. "You're out of your damn mind, Haskell," one of them said. "You can't build a working engine out of that junk." Haskell didn't look up. His hands were black with grease, moving fast and confident as he welded a cracked manifold onto a P-47 power plant pulled from a scrapyard. The thing looked like Frankenstein's monster, a patchwork of mismatched pistons, scorched tubing, and bolts scavenged from wrecked trucks. A coffee can served as a temporary fuel reservoir. The spark plugs didn't even match. "I don't need it pretty," he said flatly. "I just need it to breathe." Outside, engines groaned as pilots prepared for another escort mission over Germany. But half the squadron was grounded. Altitude failures, cold starts, cracked heads. Every spare part was weeks away. Command said to wait. Haskell refused. He had a different plan. He picked up a fuel line wrapped in duct tape, gave it a hard tug, and smiled. "See that? She's got heart," he muttered. Corporal Finch, his assistant, frowned. "Heart? That's a pile of scrap, Sarge. You're gonna blow the whole damn hangar up." "Then I'll die employed," Haskell said with a grin. The other men laughed. One lit a cigarette and yelled, "Hey, hayseed, maybe that junk'll sprout wings next." But under the noise, something different was happening. The scrap engine, an R-2800 radial rebuilt from wreckage, was alive. The welds hissed, the fittings gleamed faintly in the cold light. Haskell crouched beside it, tightening the final bolt with the slow precision of a man tuning a violin. He turned to Finch. "You ready?" "For what?" "For history." He hit the starter switch. For a moment, nothing, just silence and disbelief. Then a cough, a shudder, and suddenly a roar. The entire hangar shook. Men stumbled backward, coffee mugs spilling. The patched-together monster came alive, a deep, thunderous growl that built into a full-bore roar, steady and furious. Flames licked the exhaust pipes, blue and perfect. Finch's cigarette fell from his mouth. "Holy hell!" Haskell stood, grinning through the smoke. "Told you she'd sing." The sound was different. Not the strained whine of a factory motor, but something rawer, deeper. Every man on that airfield stopped to listen. For once, the laughter was gone. Above the noise, Haskell yelled, "They said you can't build an engine from junk." The motor bellowed in reply. He leaned close to Finch and said quietly, "Tell him that when she outruns a jet." That line, half joke, half prophecy, would echo through the hangar for months to come. Because before the war was over, that very engine, born from trash, welded by hand, would climb to 30,000 feet and prove the impossible. They laughed at him once. They never laughed again. In 1944, aircraft engines weren't built. They were born in temples. Factories in Connecticut and Detroit churned out R-2800s with surgical precision. Every component was measured down to 1,000th of an inch, every bolt certified by engineers with college degrees and clean fingernails. The manuals were gospel, and deviation was sin. Official doctrine said so in writing. Field personnel are prohibited from assembling or reconstructing engines from incomplete components. The logic was simple. A single mismatch in pressure, a single cylinder out of balance, and a fighter could tear itself apart in midair. But doctrine didn't live on the front lines. Ray Haskell did. He'd seen too many Thunderbolts grounded, their pilots stuck drinking cold coffee while the enemy ruled the sky. "We're losing the war to paperwork," he muttered once, kicking a crate marked "awaiting shipment." Every mechanic knew the frustration. Replacement parts took weeks to arrive. Air pressure regulators froze. Manifolds cracked from the cold. The official fix was always the same: wait for new components. But there was no time to wait, not when the Luftwaffe's Me-262 jets were cutting through bomber streams like scalpels. Haskell's reputation didn't help. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a problem. The kind of man who questioned everything, from torque specs to oxygen ratios. The officers called him the outlaw. The younger crewmen called him the preacher, because once he got talking about engines, he wouldn't stop. Machines got souls, he'd say, waving a wrench for emphasis. You can't build them scared. You gotta build them like you trust them. One lieutenant once sneered, "You trust an engine built from scrap? That's suicide." Haskell shot back, "So is flying one that can't breathe." To him, the manuals were written by men who'd never seen a dogfight. They measured engines in horsepower. Haskell measured them in heartbeats. He knew that a pilot's life depended less on equations and more on whether a motor wanted to live. His heresy wasn't mechanical, it was philosophical. He believed perfection killed performance. That every engine, like every man, worked best when it was pushed beyond comfort. "Engines are like soldiers," he told Finch one night over rations. "The best ones ain't built. They're broken, fixed, and still fight." Still, there was a hierarchy to defy. Regulations were sacred. Command had little patience for field experiments. "The Army didn't pay you to innovate," an inspector warned him. "They paid you to maintain." But how do you maintain something that's already dead? That question haunted Haskell every time he looked at the flight board. Names crossed out, missions aborted, engines listed as non-serviceable. Each line was another reason to stop listening to headquarters. When he finally started scavenging parts from the scrapyard behind the hangar, everyone assumed it was for practice. They didn't realize he was rewriting the laws of engine design with every weld. He didn't have a blueprint, just instinct. And maybe that was the point. Because in 1944, the world worshipped machines. But it took a man like Ray Haskell to remind them that machines only live when someone believes they can. The factory said his work was impossible. The field said it was insanity. But the sky was waiting to prove them both wrong. Long before the war, before the smell of oil and the thunder of propellers, Ray Haskell was just a barefoot kid in Iowa. His father ran a small dairy farm outside Cedar Falls. The tractors were old, the tools older, and when something broke, there was no one to call. Not that anyone would have come anyway. At 12 years old, Haskell learned the sound of failure before he ever learned the math of it. He could tell when the old Fordson tractor was about to seize just by listening. "Engines talk," his father used to say. "You just have to listen before they start lying." It stuck. By 16, Ray could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. He fixed everything with wire, tin, and faith. And his creations always worked. Sometimes they worked too well. He once built a pump that ran so efficiently it flooded the barn. When his father yelled, Ray just smiled and said, "Guess I made it too honest." He wasn't just good. He was different. He didn't think in parts. He thought in flow. He said he could feel when air moved wrong through a machine, like a draft through a window. "Air's alive," he once told a classmate. "You can't just force it. You've got to guide it." When he tried to enlist as a pilot, the Army turned him down. His eyesight wasn't good enough, and his test scores were average at best. But a recruiter noticed something strange in his aptitude chart: mechanical intuition off the scale. They sent him to technical school, then straight into the Air Corps as a junior mechanic. From the start, he didn't fit in. The other men followed the manuals like gospel. Ray used them as napkins. He was a master improviser, replacing a gasket with shoe leather, a missing bolt with a nail, a ruptured line with a piece of melted tin. Fieldcraft, his instructor called it. That'll get you court-martialed one day. But the war changed everything. By the time he reached England in '43, the rules had started breaking under reality. Logistics couldn't keep up with combat. Airfields ran dry of replacement parts, and every squadron had its own unofficial way of keeping planes flying. Ray didn't just adapt, he thrived. Pilots started asking for him by name. "Get Haskell to look at it," they'd say. "He's the one who can make metal forgive you." He became infamous for his listening tests. He'd crouch under an idling P-47, eyes closed, fingertips brushing the cowling as if sensing its pulse. "She's choking on her own air," he'd whisper. "Give me an hour." An hour later, the engine would purr. He didn't know the equations. He didn't have a degree. But he had something no textbook could teach: rhythm. He worked like a musician tuning an orchestra, always searching for harmony in chaos. By the time he joined the 354th Fighter Group, Haskell was more myth than mechanic. The pilots called him Doc Frankenstein. The brass called him a liability. But by winter 1944, with engines freezing, supply lines collapsing, and bombers falling from the sky, no one laughed when he walked into the hangar. He had a reputation now. Not for following orders, but for making machines do the impossible. So when a crippled P-47 rolled back from a mission, its cylinders shot and its manifold cracked in half, the crew chief sighed and said, "She's done." Haskell just smiled. Done's just another word for bored. That night he walked into the scrapyard, flashlight in hand, and started picking through the wreckage. He didn't see garbage, he saw potential. He didn't know it yet, but inside that pile of junk was an engine that would outclimb a jet. And all it needed was someone crazy enough to build it. By late 1944, the war in the air had turned into a race against physics. The Germans had unleashed the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It climbed twice as fast as a P-47, outran every Allied escort, and could dive through bomber formations before the Americans could even react. Its 30mm cannons shredded flying fortresses in seconds. The numbers were terrifying. A Me-262 could hit 540 miles per hour in level flight, nearly 100 mph faster than anything the U.S. had in the sky. At 30,000 feet, piston-driven planes simply ran out of breath. Their engines starved for oxygen. Compressors overheated and power dropped by nearly 40%. Pilots described it like fighting the wind with a hammer. They could climb, but only for a minute before the manifold pressure spiked. Every inch higher was a gamble. And once a jet came down from above, no amount of courage could close that gap. Ray Haskell knew those numbers. He read them on every pilot's face that came limping home. Average Thunderbolt climb rate, 2,700 feet per minute. Average Me-262 climb rate, 3,900 feet per minute. Survival odds for a P-47 caught below 20,000 feet when a jet appeared, less than 25%. The math was clear. The Allies didn't need more pilots. They needed more altitude. The trouble was, no one had an answer. Not the engineers in Wright Field, not the officers in London, not the factories in Connecticut. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R-2800 was already one of the most powerful engines on Earth. But at altitude, even that beast choked. The problem wasn't horsepower, it was air density. Thin air meant less oxygen for combustion, and less power. Turbochargers helped, but the P-47 system was complex and fragile, built for ideal lab conditions, not muddy forward bases. Every mechanic on the front line knew it. They could hear the problem in the way the supercharger whined. At low altitude, it screamed. At high altitude, it gasped. Officially, no one was allowed to alter the fuel mixture, throttle control, or turbo pressure. Unauthorized adjustments may result in catastrophic engine failure, the manuals warned. Unofficially, everyone knew someone who had tried, and almost all of them failed. Burned out cylinders, exploding turbos. Engines seized mid-flight. The system was delicate. One turned too much and the whole thing turned into shrapnel. But Haskell wasn't afraid of delicate. He started doing the math differently, not on paper, but by feel. He charted every high-altitude failure he saw, listened to the rhythm of each dying engine, and began building what he called breathing profiles. It wasn't scientific, it was sensory. He'd compare two P-47s with the same mechanical setup, but different performance, and note the difference in sound. "You hear that pulse?" he'd say. "That's back pressure trying to tell you something. Finch, his assistant, thought he was losing it. "You're talking about engines like they're people." "They are," Haskell shot back. "And right now, they're suffocating." When word reached the field that a German jet had taken down 12 bombers in one pass over Kassel, something in him snapped. He grabbed a wrench, looked at Finch, and said, "If we can't get new air, we'll make our own." That night, he began sketching what would become his band mod, a recalibrated air intake and fuel system built from scavenged parts. His theory was simple but insane. If he could alter the airflow resistance inside the manifold, he could trick the engine into thinking it was still at low altitude, forcing the turbo to maintain pressure longer. It was mechanical hypnosis, and it would either make the plane unstoppable or blow it to pieces. And to everyone's disbelief, he chose to test it himself. The test wasn't supposed to happen. There was no authorization, no safety crew, no paperwork. Just a frost-bitten morning, a hangar full of skeptics, and one mechanic who refused to ask permission. Ray Haskell stood beside the P-47, its nose open like a beast waiting to breathe. The engine gleamed under the pale English sun, a Frankenstein creation of scavenged parts and welded dreams. He'd spent 48 hours straight rebuilding it, feeding oxygen lines through improvised tubing, reinforcing the manifold with steel scraps from bomb casings, and adjusting the turbo regulator by hand, an act considered borderline suicidal. Finch stood a few feet away, holding a clipboard and shaking his head. "You sure about this, Sarge?" "No," Haskell said. "But she is." He climbed into the cockpit, straps cutting into his shoulders. The pilots watched from a distance, whispering. Some had bets on how fast the thing would explode. Others just wanted to see if it would start at all. The prop spun once, twice, then the engine caught. Not with a scream, but with a deep, throaty growl that rolled across the airfield like thunder. Haskell grinned. "You hear that? She's not begging for air anymore." He pushed the throttle gently. The roar built, low and steady. No coughing, no stutter. The sound was pure, balanced, alive. Finch called out, "Manifold pressure holding steady at 55. "Good," Haskell replied. "Let's see what happens when we sin a little." He eased the throttle further, past the red line. The needle trembled, then steadied. The roar deepened. A wave of heat shimmered off the cowling. Then, without warning, the turbocharger kicked in, hard. The hangar windows rattled. The sound sharpened into a rising wail that made men cover their ears. "Jesus Christ," Finch muttered. "It's breathing like it's still on the ground." Exactly as planned. Haskell looked down at the gauges. Power output, 2,400 horsepower. Altitude simulation, 28,000 feet. Stable. He stared at the numbers and started to laugh. "She's faking altitude, Finch. The bastard's actually doing it." "Don't push her," Finch yelled. "She'll blow." "She's fine," Haskell said, eyes locked on the panel. "She's finally alive." After 10 minutes of sustained full power, the exhaust temperature stayed green. The pressure didn't spike. The airflow mod worked. Against every regulation, every warning, every engineer's prediction, the scrap engine was running smoother than factory spec. But Haskell wasn't satisfied. He had to see it fly. He jumped down from the cockpit, barked at the pilots, and pointed to the nearest man in a flight jacket. "Larson, you up for a joyride?" The pilot blinked. "In that death trap? Hell no." Haskell smirked. "Then I'll do it myself." Minutes later, Finch was strapping him in. "If she blows, you'll die before you hit the ground." Haskell gave him a half grin. "Then I'll die ahead of schedule." The propeller blurred to life. The P-47 rolled down the muddy strip, kicking up a rooster tail of dirt. Mechanics dove for cover. The plane lifted off, wobbled, then steadied. And then it climbed. Faster than any Thunderbolt had before. At 10,000 feet, the tower radioed, "Test plane holding." At 20,000, "Engine stable, throttle full." At 30,000, "Power still climbing. Repeat, climbing." Finch dropped the headset, staring upward. Through the thin clouds, the silver dot of the P-47 shimmered like a coin tossed into heaven. When Haskell landed 20 minutes later, the hangar fell silent. The engine hadn't cracked, hadn't smoked, hadn't faltered. It was still purring, hot, steady, unstoppable. He pulled off his goggles, covered in oil and frost, and said simply, "She just outran the air she breathes." The men who'd laughed at him didn't say a word. One finally whispered, "You built a monster." Haskell wiped the sweat from his face. "No," he said softly. "I built her honest." The next day, a test pilot would take her higher. And that's when the world would find out just how far a scrap engine could go. By the time word of the test flight reached command, the Haskell engine had already become legend. Pilots whispered about it in mess halls. Ground crews argued about whether it was luck, madness, or genius. But the data didn't care about opinions. It cared about numbers. And those numbers told a story no one could ignore. At 30,000 feet, where most P-47s lost nearly 40% of their engine power, Haskell's rebuild held 94% efficiency. The manifold pressure remained constant, the turbocharger didn't surge, and fuel burn stayed balanced across all 18 cylinders. Engineers at Wright Field later estimated that his improvised manifold mod improved total airflow by 32%, using nothing but salvaged tubing and hand-filed valves. It wasn't supposed to work. According to the textbooks, it couldn't. The R-2800 was designed for precision machining, exact tolerances, and perfect factory calibration. The slightest imperfection meant imbalance. Imbalance meant death. But Haskell's fix exploited something even engineers hadn't fully understood: airflow flexibility. His improvised ductwork didn't fight the air, it guided it. The bent pipes and uneven welds actually helped redistribute flow turbulence inside the manifold, preventing cold pockets that robbed power at altitude. In other words, what the brass called junk, physics called adaptive engineering. Finch wrote the numbers down on the back of a ration box. 32% improved oxygen retention, 18% reduction in turbo lag, 11% cooler cylinder head temperature at full throttle. Scrap math, Haskell called it, laughing. Guess the junkyard knows more than the university. The irony was brutal. While the Luftwaffe poured millions of Reichsmarks into advanced jet turbines and experimental alloys, an American mechanic had used literal trash to close the performance gap, and he didn't even file a patent. When the engineers from London HQ finally arrived, clipboard in hand, they demanded to inspect the plane. Haskell stood by silently as they circled the aircraft, jotting notes. One of them, a young lieutenant with shiny boots, sneered at the uneven welds and rough metal patches. "This isn't regulation work," he said. "This entire assembly violates every maintenance protocol in the book." Haskell shrugged. "Funny, it violates gravity just fine." The lieutenant glared. "You understand that if this mod fails in combat, you'll be court-martialed?" Haskell smiled. "Then I hope it fails loud." But it didn't. 2 days later, that same P-47 escorted bombers over the Ruhr. The pilot, Lieutenant Charlie Larson, radioed mid-flight. 32,000 feet and still climbing. Engines singing. "Jesus, it feels like it's breathing fresh air up here." He wasn't exaggerating. With the scrap mod, the Thunderbolt hit speeds approaching 460 mph, nearly 20 mph faster than standard models. In a shallow dive, it even touched 480 German Me-262s that tried to climb and loop, lost their advantage for the first time. The P-47s could finally chase instead of flee. Back on the ground, the numbers spread through the engineering corps like wildfire. Commanders demanded blueprints. Factories requested specifications. But Haskell didn't have either. His blueprints were in his head, and his method couldn't be mass-produced. It relied on instinct, and instinct doesn't fit on a parts list. When asked to replicate the engine for official testing, he simply said, "I could build it again, but I couldn't explain it." The brass hated that answer. The pilots loved it. Because while the scientists argued about theory, the results spoke louder. Haskell's mod cut engine failures by 40% across his group. Not one of his modified planes went down due to mechanical issues for the rest of the war. That's when the field crews started calling it the scrap gospel. And the higher-ups, the ones who once called him reckless, quietly reclassified his method as Field Adaptation Procedure Number 47A. They'd never admit it publicly. But they all knew what it meant. The day scrap metal beat science wasn't an accident. It was proof that genius doesn't wear a badge. It carries a wrench. February 1945. The clouds over the Rhine were thick as smoke, the kind that hid death until it was too late. A squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts from the 354th Fighter Group had just finished escorting bombers back from Cologne when the radio crackled with the words every pilot dreaded. Bandits, high, 3 o'clock, multiple contacts closing fast. German jets, Me-262s, the predators of the sky. Lieutenant Charlie Larson, flying Haskell's scrap-engine Thunderbolt, looked up and saw them slicing through the overcast like silver blades. He could almost feel their speed, the hiss of jet engines closing the distance. "Jesus," his wingman muttered. "They're diving right through us." 2 jets roared past, cannons blazing. A B-17 in the formation below exploded in a flash of orange, falling apart in midair. Another Me-262 curved upward, rolling inverted, setting up for another pass. Larson yanked his stick back, trying to climb, expecting the same sluggish drag he'd always felt above 25,000 feet. But this time, the plane responded. Instant throttle, clean pull, no lag. The P-47 leapt upward like a living thing. "Control's good," he radioed. "Climbing. 30,000. No answer. His squadron was scattered, dodging cannon fire. He caught a glimpse of one jet looping above him, its belly gleaming. On instinct, he pushed the throttle to the stops. The scrap engine howled. The Thunderbolt didn't slow. It surged. Larson's eyes widened. Holy hell. The altimeter spun. 28,000, 29,000, 30,000 feet. The Me-262 was still higher, but not for long. For the first time in the war, a piston engine wasn't gasping at altitude. He radioed, "She's holding. Repeat, she's holding at 31,000. The German pilot saw it too. The jet banked hard, trying to dive out of range. Larson fired a short burst. Tracers streaked past, bright and fast. He didn't expect a hit just to make him flinch. But then, the Me-262 stalled. The German had pushed too hard too soon. The jet shuddered, lost lift, just enough for Larson to close the gap. He lined up his shot. 2-second burst. The P-47's 850 calibers roared in perfect sync, the air thick with fire and brass. The tracers walked across the Me-262's right engine, which erupted in a fountain of smoke. "Splash one jet," Larson muttered. Below, the radio came alive. "Jesus Christ! A jug just bagged a 262. In the cockpit, Larson could hardly believe it himself. The gauges stayed steady, the turbo pressure perfect. No stutter, no heat spike. He whispered, almost in awe, "She's not supposed to be able to do this." Back at base, the mechanics crowded around when he landed. The engine still purred like a big cat, smooth and rhythmic. Finch was waiting, grinning ear to ear. "You crazy bastard," he said. "You outclimbed a jet." Haskell didn't smile. He just walked around the plane, listening to the idle, his hand resting on the cowling. "She did what she was made to do," he said quietly. "She remembered how to breathe." Word spread like wildfire across England. The scrap jet killer, they called it. In official reports, the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't mention the modification. The after-action summary simply read, "Exceptional engine performance recorded. Altitude anomaly unverified." But among pilots, it was already legend. They began asking, "Who's got one of Haskell's engines?" as if it were a brand of magic. And for one strange, impossible month before the war's end, scrap-built Thunderbolts ruled the sky. Because sometimes the miracle isn't in the machine, it's in the man who refuses to let it die. March 1945. The war in Europe was burning itself out, but the skies were still full of ghosts, pilots and planes fighting on instinct, long after logic said they should have been dead. At Leiston Airfield, one of those ghosts was about to take off again. The P-47 with the scrap engine sat on the tarmac under a cold dawn. Its nose was patched and scarred, the silver skin blackened from exhaust. But inside, the motor was perfect, a symphony of welded parts and defiant math. Haskell had orders to ground it. The command wanted the engine shipped to London for study. "That's not a plane anymore," one officer said. "It's a research specimen." But to Haskell and Finch, it wasn't a specimen, it was a weapon. Larson arrived at the hangar still wearing his flight jacket from yesterday's sortie. "They want to lock her up," he said, disgusted. "Over my dead body," Haskell muttered. They looked at each other, and in that wordless glance, the plan was made. At Euro 700, without authorization, they fueled the plane. No paperwork, no permission, just conviction. The tower called out, "Thunderbolt 27, you are not cleared for flight." But the jug was already rolling. As the plane lifted off, the air shimmered in its wake, like heat off desert sand. Finch stood on the runway, jaw tight, watching it disappear into the morning haze. "Godspeed, you beautiful idiot," he whispered. Larson's mission was simple: push the engine to its limit, record everything, and bring it home. But 25 minutes into the flight, he got company, 3 German jets, Me-262s flying north to intercept bombers. He could have turned back. He didn't. Instead, he throttled forward. The modified turbos sang like a chainsaw at full scream. The altimeter ticked past 25,000, then 28,000, then 31,000 feet. The German jets climbed after him, but something strange happened. They couldn't close the distance. Larson leaned into the radio. "Finch, you better be listening to this. She's still climbing, 33,000 feet. Static. Then Finch's voice, breathless. "Don't you dare stall her." "Not planning to," Larson said, "but I think they just might." He rolled left, then right. Wide turns the P-47 was never meant to handle at this altitude. The plane didn't buck or wheeze, it flowed. Below, one Me-262 tried to cut him off. Larson dove, swung under it, and climbed again. The jet's pilot overcorrected and stalled, vapor streaming off his wings. Larson lined him up and fired. The tracers sliced through the thin air, finding metal. Explosion. Smoke. One jet gone. The other 2 broke off, unwilling to chase. Larson didn't cheer. He just exhaled slowly, watching the wreckage fall through the clouds. Then he looked at his gauges. Engine temperature normal, pressure stable, oil clean. It didn't make sense, but it didn't have to. He turned home. When he landed, there was no applause, just silence. The kind that comes when everyone realizes they've just seen something history won't believe. The officers who'd tried to ground him were waiting. "You disobeyed a direct order," one barked. Larson shrugged. "Maybe, but I brought her back." They looked at the readings, engine output, altitude logs, temperature reports, and couldn't find a single fault. The mechanic who'd built it stood quietly in the corner, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sir," Finch said, "if that's illegal, you might want to rewrite the law." The officer paused, then turned to Haskell. "How did you even know this would work?" Haskell smiled. "Didn't know, just believed." In that moment, even the brass understood. It wasn't rebellion. It was faith. The next morning, they disassembled the engine and shipped it to Wright Field under guard. The official report called it Experimental Variant Number 13. But among pilots, it had a better name: the Miracle of Boxted. Because at 30,000 feet, one mechanic's ridiculous engine had just rewritten what was possible for a propeller-driven plane, and all it cost was the courage to ignore a manual. When the war ended, the papers never mentioned Ray Haskell's name. There were no medals, no ceremonies, no photographs of him shaking hands with generals. The reports buried his work under layers of technical language: unverified performance variants, field deviation from approved maintenance procedure. The brass couldn't admit that a grease-stained mechanic in a muddy hangar had outperformed the engineers at Wright Field and Pratt & Whitney combined. But among those who mattered, the pilots, the crews, the men who survived, his story became legend. They said that when Haskell's Thunderbolts took off, they sounded different. Not louder, not faster, just alive. The Air Force later confirmed that 6 planes using Haskell's scrap configuration flew more than 20 combat sorties without a single engine failure. 4 of them scored confirmed kills against Me-262s. None were lost to mechanical breakdown. The post-war analysis revealed what Haskell had never written down. His welded Frankenstein manifolds produced a self-correcting airflow pattern, balancing cylinder pressure at altitude and preventing the surging that crippled most R-2800s. He'd stumbled into a discovery that would later inspire jet engine intake design: the physics of imperfection. In 1947, an engineer at Wright Field wrote privately, "Haskell's field mod was crude, dangerous, and brilliant. In all probability, it advanced our understanding of high-altitude combustion by a decade." But the Army never declassified his name. When Finch tried to nominate him for commendation, the request was quietly denied. "Unauthorized modification," the memo read. "Not to be repeated." So Haskell went home, back to Iowa, back to the farm where he'd first learned that engines could sing. He never talked about what he built. When neighbors asked about the war, he just said, "I fixed a few planes that didn't want to die." Years later, when jet engines became the new kings of the sky, a few test engineers visited him. They found him sitting on a stool in a dusty barn, sharpening tools. When they asked how he'd known how to tune airflow the way he did, he grinned and said, "I didn't tune it. I listened to it." One of them, decades later, called him the last of the listener engineers. And maybe that's the truest legacy. Not a formula, not a patent, but a lesson carved into the sky itself. Perfection doesn't win wars. Audacity does. Because sometimes the greatest acts of engineering don't come from factories or blueprints. They come from a man in a freezing hangar surrounded by broken metal, who looks at the impossible and says, "I can make it fly." And the next time the world hears a roar at 30,000 feet, somewhere in that sound, buried deep in the turbines and the fire, is the echo of a mechanic who built miracles from scrap. Years after the war, the skies went quiet. The props stopped spinning, the airfields turned to farmland, and the roar of the Thunderbolt became a memory. But in one small corner of Iowa, that sound never truly died. Ray Haskell's workshop was nothing more than a wooden shed behind his house, a place where the floor creaked and the walls smelled like oil and rain. Inside, hanging from a beam, was a single piece of metal, the warped manifold from his scrap engine, welded, dented, and blackened by fire, the same one that had carried a P-47 to 30,000 feet and outrun a jet. Visitors would sometimes ask him why he kept it. He'd just smile and say, "It still breathes when the wind hits it." That was Ray, the man who refused to let metal die. The man who proved that genius isn't about knowing every number. It's about hearing what the numbers can't say. He lived quietly, fixing tractors, teaching local kids how to weld, and flying crop dusters for extra cash. He never mentioned the war unless someone brought it up. And when they did, he'd look toward the horizon and say, "Those engines, they had souls. You could feel them talk when they wanted to live." Decades later, an aviation historian stumbled upon his old service file in a forgotten drawer at Wright Field. In red ink, the notes read, "Unauthorized modification, performance unrepeatable, probable fluke." But attached to the same folder was a flight log, one that told a different story. March 9th, 1945. Altitude 30,200 feet, airspeed 465 mph. Engine stable. Duration 1 hour, 14 minutes. Under comments, a single line written in pencil, "Engine breathes like it's got a heart." The historian tracked down Finch, now in his 90s. When asked about Haskell, the old man just laughed softly. "Yeah," he said, "they called him crazy. But every time those P-47s went up, he gave us a reason to believe we could win. Not because he followed rules, but because he broke the right ones." At air shows today, when a restored Thunderbolt fires up, the ground still shakes with that familiar low, rolling growl, the kind that sounds more alive than mechanical. And if you listen closely, somewhere in that thunder, you can almost hear Ray's voice. "Engines got souls. You just gotta let 'em breathe." Because war isn't only won by bullets or bombs. Sometimes it's won by the hands that refuse to stop turning a wrench even when everyone else says it's hopeless. And maybe, just maybe, that's the truest kind of heroism, the quiet kind that leaves no medals, only motion.